Hi, let me tell you a little something about Superman. It's common knowledge that Superman is a metaphor for no one else but Jesus Christ. Both came to earth and lived a human life, as mortals among mortals, performed miracles, and they both modeled the virtue of self-sacrifice. But of course, there are also the ones who know that Superman is an allegory for Moses, a savior who escapes death as an infant and is gifted with great power and burdened by the great responsibilities that accompany it. Some even compare him to Buddha, an enlightened being who often makes self-sacrifices in order to help others achieve a greater good. Others might argue that he is akin to the Norse god Thor, a man who wields great power and protects the innocent from the evils of the world. But we can't forget those who consider him to be more alike to the Egyptian god Horus, an exalted being with godly powers derived from the sun, tasked by his parents to protect people. But again, there are those who see his story as resembling Greek myths more, the story of Hercules to be precise, a legendary hero, a demigod, famous for his fantastical feats. And then some people say he embodies the ideas of Nietzsche's Overman, an enlightened man who represents the ideal moral principles of humanity and inspires others to reach for greatness. Modern Kemp's definition of an icon is as follows: that has achieved wholly exceptional levels of widespread recognizability and has come to carry a rich series of varied associations for very large numbers of people across time and cultures, such that it has to a greater or lesser degree transgressed the parameters of its initial making, function, context, and meaning. Kemp also states that iconic figures tend to generate a huge number of progeny, with their initial image accumulating stories that often bear only a faint resemblance to themselves, so much so that new creators usually find themselves confused by the myths surrounding these figures, some even accepting them as truth. All these features arguably apply to the man of tomorrow. Just a simple Google search for Superman proves both Kemp's thesis and that discussions about Superman, from his conception all the way to today, have invoked numerous historical figures, both fictional and real. He can even be interpreted in many different ways without making a connection to other fictions. To some, he is the representation of hope and the belief that even in the darkest of times, there's always a way forward. Some see him as a critique of modern society, as he often stands up to corrupt politicians and corporations. To others, he is a symbol of the American dream, an immigrant who became the nation's hero through hard work. But they all forget one simple thing.
Why would he give them his ring? It still doesn't make any sense.
John's a strange one, that's for sure.
I'm beginning to think all you humans are. Sorry.
It's all right. I take it as a compliment.
The fundamental concept of Superman is that he embodies the essence of humanity in all the ways that counts. Traditionally, Jonathan Kent's death is portrayed as a result of a heart attack rather than a dramatic event. This approach is logically more coherent, as the main purpose of his father's death is to convey to Clark that, despite his powers, there are some people he simply cannot save. This lesson is what grounds him, but makes him human instead of an alien or a god. This unavoidable event is the most humanizing moment of his life, and by changing it from an inevitable moment beyond his control to something he could easily prevent, will rob him of this crucial moment of characterization. As demonstrated, there's a tendency to interpret Superman as a specific concept, or as a modern reimagining of a specific myth, legend, or religious figure. I would argue these kinds of comparisons reveal more about the person making them than they do about the character himself. Superman is an adopted son, just like Moses was, but he's also the master of self-discipline, just like Overman, so for poorly defined reasons, he's more like Overman than Moses. This approach shows a desire to fit Superman into a pre-existing framework, which creates more of an idealized version of the character, and as stated by philosopher Jean-Luc Marion, the ideal acts as a mirror, not a portrait, and unmasks the mirror because it fills the gaze. As such, drawing parallels between Superman and figures like Moses or Jesus may seem insightful but actually oversimplifies the character's complex history and significance to modern ideas of the good. By seeing him only as a reflection of their own conceptual preferences, people miss the much broader context of his creation during a time of widespread crisis of faith. He is very much the product of modernism. Nietzsche's idea of the perfect human completely rejecting external notions of good and evil, law and religion for their own self-defined values is quite radical. However, the idea of Superman is not about ignoring these aspects absolutely, nor is he about being guided by external ideas. Superman is about the balance of these two extremes, someone who is only influenced by societal, cultural, or religious standards of morality. I don't mean to rob him of any religious significance. Any worthwhile analysis of Superman must consider the powerful cultural significance he has. A study of him has to not only examine his character along with his long history, but also explore some of the fundamental ideas that define Western cultural identity, because Superman's rich and ever-evolving narrative is merely a reflection of how we, ourselves, understand the complex world we live in. My argument, therefore, is that Superman should be viewed as a cultural effort to understand the nature of virtue, instead of only viewed through a very specific framework. There are many reasons for why Superman is worthy of more in-depth investigations. I propose 4 major reasons for why the character needs to be further analyzed. 1 is his continued mainstream presence from his inception all the way to the modern day and age. 2nd is that he is viewed by a large sum of people as a figure who represents the American national symbol, a title that in turn grants him a level of significance higher than his status as a simple product ever would. 3rd is that beyond the surface level enjoyment of his stories, there are also certain insights and lessons present within them. And lastly, although he remained a relevant figure across many consecutive decades, embodying some of America's most cherished values, he has still attracted less analytical attention than his much darker, more sulking friend. Even more troubling are the studies that do exist of the Man of Steel, which mostly recycle popular yet flawed hypotheses about the main man and his evolution. I personally do not subscribe to the notion that superhero stories are inherently less complicated than, for instance, poetry when it comes to presenting their messages. The traditional mass cultural prejudice against comic books deserves to be meaningfully explored in a video of its own, something which I plan to do in the future. The mass appeal and ageless relevance of Superman stems not only from his similarities with ancient gods and heroes, but also, as I stated not long ago, because he represents our efforts to portray the concept of the good, a philosophical ideal that has puzzled deep thinkers since Plato. The simple fact that Superman has managed to stay the single most popular character in fiction for decades on end highlights that superhero stories can engage deep philosophical concepts and moral questions, just like any other art form, and their value should be recognized. The classic Superman's acts of good were explicitly showcased as forms of socio-political interventions. In a world where some have power and some do not, the virtuous Superman is on the side of the powerless, the champion of the oppressed, as he has been labeled by many in the past. Justice, for him, is less about individual rights, and more about how wealth is dispensed amongst the people. This Superman confronts and challenges economic inequalities directly, showcasing that his concept of good prioritizes ethical principles over the economy, and disregards the laws of society that protect people's property rights. This violation is most evident in Action Comics issue 12, where he declares war on the capitalist system by going against businesses and property that he believes contribute to injustice. He destroys cars that the police impounded for traffic violations, believing that simple confiscation is not good enough of a punishment. He sabotages a car salesman's business because the vehicles sold there are unsafe. And lastly, he completely demolishes a car factory because its owner uses cheaper materials to maximize profits at the cost of human lives. The fact that these acts are violations of the law is underlined in more than one panel, wherein police officers attempt to stop his destructive rampage to no avail. The message classic Superman conveys is that the social order is corrupt, to such a degree that the virtuous man must therefore break the law in order to fight against it, rather than trust in the law's objectivity. When discussing Superman, it's almost impossible not to recognize how his image has evolved significantly over time. From the late 30s all the way to the end of the Second World War, he was depicted as a more brutal and aggressive character compared to the heroic one seen in modern comics and films. The story of the aforementioned comic ends with Superman kidnapping the mayor and forcing him to confront the consequences of his failure to enforce safety regulations, after which the mayor gleefully ignores Superman's acts of terrorism, and gleefully declares Superman has shown the error of his ways, and he swears to do everything in his power to see that, henceforth, traffic laws are rigidly enforced by the police. As you can see, this Superman often used his powers without much concern for the collateral damage they caused. He would often confront criminals physically and interrogate them in a tone that, considering the reception of the Man of Steel movie, would shock people reading nowadays. His actions in this comic was the norm for him, as this bold and uncompromising hero is what the generation needed from him in order to win their hearts. This explains why the writers refrain from providing the readers with his thought processes, and opted to narrate his actions instead. Their intentions is to preserve the image of the Superman as someone who is without weakness. For to show a character's inner thoughts, You must reference their personal fears, but doing so would undermine the meticulously constructed image of an invincible man. But it seems the creators at the time had more desire to criticize the political system of capitalist democracy, by way of the character's highly moralized actions, which in turn presented this incarnation of Superman as nothing but a socialist terrorist. Considering the political climate of the late 30s, you would think that the distinctly Marxist ideas on ethics promoted in these early stories will likely receive backlash, but superheroes being viewed too childish for major critics to pay attention to, allowed the creators to push the boundaries much harder than they could have in any other medium. However, this could not remain the case for too long, because as they grew in popularity, mainly thanks to Superman's unprecedented early success, they changed from a micro-segment of commercials into a widely popular and profitable form of entertainment, changing the landscape for future storytelling. Subsequent storytellers now had to balance their messages with compromise in order to be profitable and to avoid backlash. The past cannot be erased. In 1935, there were only 2 comic book publishers in America. They produced about 10 regular titles between them, but only 2 of those titles, New Fun and New Comics, created original content, and they did not sell well. Just 5 years later, in 1940, the number of publishers rose from the meager 2 to 23, producing over 150 original titles, with most of them revolving around rainbow-color costumed crime fighters. DC, in an attempt to ensure the characters remain uncontroversial and positive role models, thereby reinforcing their appeal as figures of true heroism, portrayed them as paragons of virtue, aligning them with the mainstream moral standards of the time. To achieve this, they implemented strict guidelines, including 2 rules. 1. They could not kill, and 2. They could not be the direct cause of property damage, only their villains. The decision to reboot Superman might have resulted in the alienation of fans who had grown attached to the original incarnation of the character. But it was their sense of nostalgia that not only kept him popular, but also became integral to the character's identity. Nostalgia functions as a way to help preserve and organize our memories. In the case of Superman, his writers consistently embedded memory triggers into his character. These mostly included, but were not limited to, catchphrases like "look up in the sky" and "truth, justice, and the American way." But unlike the ever-changing portrayal of Superman, the depiction of his alter ego remained relatively the same throughout history. Clark had always been a man of humble appearance, characterized by his awkward mannerisms and the overall impression of a simple man raised on a farm by loving parents. As such, Superman was not only a representation of an idealized hero, but a role model on top of that. Clark was the reflection of the American work ethic. Many people were of the opinion that his stories presented Superman using Clark Kent to showcase his less than favorable view of us mere mortals, as before the new guidelines were introduced, his Clark Kent persona was a clumsy and incompetent individual. This belief was what the famous Kill Bill scene was referencing. Personally, I think this is either an unintentional, or more likely, intentional mischaracterization of him. No matter which version of Superman you pick, one aspect of his character has remained consistent throughout history. He has and will always care deeply for humanity, and doesn't try to ridicule us for our flaws, but rather to highlight our strengths. Superman did not grow up on another planet. He grew up on Earth, living his life as Clark Kent. He is Clark Kent, and he is Superman. After the new rules for superheroes were integrated by DC, Clark's presence became more of an attempt to effectively balance the lack of first-person perspective Superman comics had. Clark served as a contrasting figure. He now provides an important role in showcasing the other side of the Man of Steel, his more human side. If they have to keep Superman shrouded in mystery and strength, Clark gives an opportunity to add depth to the character, to show us that he's not at all the invincible god he seems to be. There are 2 sides of the same coin, if you will. He is not the one-dimensional character so many claim him to be. Thus, Clark Kent is not Superman's secret identity. He is not Batman. They are both genuine aspects of his self. It is therefore my belief that the contrast between Superman's 2 identities also represents the American struggle between their desire for individualism and the greater good. In the 300th issue of Superman, the story imagines a world where he arrived on Earth not in the late 30s, but in the 70s. When he reveals himself to the masses, they accept salvation from him, but instead he tells them he is someone who wanted you to look not to heroes and false gods for salvation, someone who has enough faith to know your salvation is within you, all of you, someone who believes in your own capacity for self-reliance. This comic highlights the timeless nature of Superman and what he stands for. It presents a new take on the famous tagline, "Look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane," to remind us that, for all of time, Superman, like America, will only ever have the best intentions for humanity. By explaining to us, gullible fools, the true salvation lies within, Superman reaffirms the American ideal of individualism. It was around this time when Superman came to closely align with the specific ideology of the era, reflecting America's self-image as the foremost global power. This change meant that Superman's actions and set of beliefs mirrored the vision of America being the leader of the free world. In 1942, the Navy Department declared Superman comics to be essential supplies destined for the Marine garrison at Midway Islands, according to a report by Time magazine. The Army ran a library service in hopes of maintaining morale amongst the troops. Through 1943 and early 1944, the Army Library Services circulated at least 100,000 copies of Superman comics every month. When you attempt to make a connection between Superman and World War II, you're met with a dilemma. These superhero comics were the most common contact overseas servicemen had with their homeland. Reports from officers stated that they were passed among men until they fell apart. As such, these children's comics did more than entertain. They provided Americans with a coherent vision of the war's purpose, defending democracy, a cause that was associated with the right to an abundance of goods and services, something already considered to be the American way. But if this unstoppable hero were to use his powers to bring an end to the war swiftly, his world would diverge too much from reality and alienate his readers. Yet if he didn't intervene, then what kind of hero, or rather what kind of American, would that make him? The writers, likely influenced by a PR group, chose the most lucrative approach. They had their cake and ate it too. This resulted in Superman being depicted as both involved and uninvolved. He stood behind and supported America's belief in self-reliance, but avoided direct involvement in the war effort. Except when he didn't. One example of this can be seen in a Sunday comic strip from November 21 in 1943, where Superman decides to let two Marines have the glory for a change as he comments, "How can you beat soldiers with that sort of spirit? The spirit that makes Americans fight against any sort of odds. For me to intervene would be, well, presumptuous." During this period, he embodied the US government's view on the war effort as democratic people unleashing their wrath at tyranny. This alignment was what helped to cement Superman's association with America's own self-image. And thanks to a highly successful radio serial in 1942, the mantra "Truth, Justice, and the American Way" was presented next to the image of the ever-hopeful sun-derived powered alien. Paired with this purposefully vague set of ideas, Superman had now evolved into America's self-elected symbol, a man who both reflected and helped to spread the nation's idealized image of itself. Although Superman himself never spoke the phrase, at least not from what I could find, he nevertheless did represent what it entailed. Furthermore, it could also be argued that even his contemporary self still represents the phrase. Due to our limited perception of reality, we can never really discover the absolute truth, not actually. This is why we must think critically about the ideas presented to us instead of following them blindly, as one person's truth may very well be another's lie based on their own subjective viewpoint. Rather than just adopting someone else's ideas as our own, we should internalize them and understand them for ourselves. This way, their ideas become relevant to us instead of being borrowed or stolen concepts. Classic Clark Kent personifies this message. He became a journalist because it was an easy way for Superman to know where he was needed. This still remains in his modern counterpart today, but now he also has a genuine interest in journalism. He enjoys uncovering the truth and listening to the opinions of the everyday people. He investigates the truth presented by other people and develops his own idea of the truth. By the 80s, the nation's opinion of Superman had shifted significantly. He was viewed as a naive and willing puppet of authority. Thus he gained the title Boy Scout. The greatest evidence of this perception is in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman labels him as a pawn of the government and proceeds to beat the ever-living shit out of the idealistic Boy Scout that was his best friend. You can tell that Frank was immensely unbiased towards Superman. After the war, a cultural shift occurred in America, and this new view highlighted that change. Once heralded as a representation of the collective's idea of the good, he had now become a symbol of unthinking loyalty, an outdated idea of the good, reflecting the public's growing skepticism towards traditional values and distrust in institutions. One shared theme in criticism of 50s and 60s Superman comics is that they are only children's propaganda for capitalist ideals. But after reading the comics from that era, it becomes clear that that is not the case. As I've already suggested, they are more similar to fantasy tales set in modern times rather than propaganda for any political messages. The themes of these stories more often explore psychological as opposed to political concepts. For instance, the story of Superman's origin explores the theme of personal loss and identity, rather than any capitalist principles. Another example is that of Elliot Magin's Must There Be a Superman, in which an alien race presents our boy in blue with a dilemma about his role on Earth. They urge him to consider whether or not his presence is beneficial to the development of our species. The way Elliot explores this question is through Superman witnessing economic exploitation that leads him to self-doubt about the good he can actually achieve with his powers. This is kicked off via our Boy Scout protecting a young Mexican immigrant from abuse by an American farmer. And by the end, he comes to the conclusion that while he can stop natural disasters, help rebuild homes, and stop outside threats to humanity, he can only guide us away from the smaller, systematic issues of the world. In this story, it's by way of supporting the exploited farm workers in their labor strikes via an arousing speech. He says to them, "You don't need a Superman. What you really need is a supervillain to be guardians of your own destiny." Many people view him as a perfect person, meaning, thanks to his unwavering moral code, he always does the right thing and never makes mistakes. But that could not be further from the truth. A significant portion of his character is about the faults of his actions. He is not infallible. He is often unsure of what the best course of action is, or whether his choices are the correct ones. Despite his right intentions, he sometimes messes up, but he learns from these mistakes and evolves. This is a mirror to the human experience. We don't always foresee the outcome of our actions, but we aim to have the right moral intent. There's no definitive right or good. Superman recognizes this and tries his absolute best to align with our society's morality. The point of this comic was not to give an answer to the economic issue presented by the story, but instead Superman, and by extension the reader, was forced to confront the painful, God-honest truth. It is difficult to know what the correct thing to do is in certain situations. That even with great power and morally good intentions, it's sometimes hard to do the right thing. That if defined as an act that injures no one, a purely virtuous act may be impossible. To quote Pascal, "From all bodies and minds, we could not draw one movement of true charity that is impossible and of another supernatural order." Consequently, this message suggests that Superman's honest desire to do good is itself also a problem, for his speech at the end seems quite meaningless and doesn't really help their cause in any way. But even if Superman seemingly does the wrong thing, it can only be for the right reasons. So he is shown to try his absolute best to be helpful to their cause, without imposing his will on anybody. If Superman meant to represent us all, then his failure to help here is a failure on our behalf. There's a persistent challenge in ethics. Despite our good intentions, there's often a gap between them and the actual outcomes of our actions influenced by them. Every ethical system we have ever managed to devise has failed to resolve the issues of inequality and exploitation which persist across different cultures and throughout the evolutionary history of our species as an advanced civilization. Basically, we have a real difficult time with aligning our ethical goals with effective actions. It's quite the complex ethical problem that this naive puppet was forced to face, wouldn't you say? Then came the year 2011, the time when DC overhauled its universe following the events of their greatly overrated Flashpoint storyline. The Superman was reinvented for a modern audience yet again. His costume was updated to be more of a uniform than a costume, providing him with a more mature appearance, serving as a metaphor for a more quote-unquote serious take on humanity's idol. And at this point, it's difficult to pinpoint who this new Superman was exactly. With Kandor destroyed and nearly every single Kryptonian wiped out, he is now more concerned with learning about Krypton's history and finding evil would-be conquerors of Earth, gods, and godly figures. Now Superman is at the forefront and Clark Kent has been relegated to more of an obstacle to overcome. This shift marks one of the clearest differences between classic and modern Superman. The other side of his coin no longer receives the same amount of focus nor care. Nowadays we get an insight into his inner workings, not through Kent, but through Superman. These differences reflect a shift in focus from his alter ego to a more simple emotional expression. While often representing the best of us, he has at times been used to reinforce problematic views on the concepts of good and evil. For a time in the 50s, for example, Superman comics became part of the broader cultural push towards anti-communism, with the Man of Steel fighting communist villains. Here he transcended objective heroism to enter the realms of wartime propaganda, defining the American way as unity born from fighting against the nation's enemies. On the cover of Action Comics issue 58, he, in an out-of-character gesture loaded with racial undertones, he encouraged his fellow Americans to slap a Jap by purchasing war bonds. This image with a racist depiction of a Japanese soldier served to fuel racial hatred. Robert Maxwell, who controlled the destiny of the Superman radio program with millions of avid listeners at the time, did not shy away from the role he played in shaping young minds. After being requested to tone down the program's malignant messaging, he replied to the Office of Wartime Information that his intent was to instill a deep-seated hatred towards America's wartime enemies, saying he was teaching this vast audience to hate, and to erase any distinction between the individuals and the state they represented, insisting that a German is a Nazi and a Jap is the little yellow fellow who knifed us in the back at Pearl Harbor, and to disagree with him was only to make for confusion. This highlights the darker facet of American exceptionalism, where the hero once celebrated as a universal symbol of justice was now repackaged to advocate for someone's personal ideological agenda. Thankfully, this did not last for long and remained a brief period in the character's history. To sum it up, from the late 30s to contemporary times, Superman's virtue manifested itself in a chameleon-like way, as in it adapted to different ideological formations of each decade that came and went, and following historical contexts. From revolutionary socialism to wartime populism, to capitalism, to escapism, all the way to reflecting self-skepticism. Once upon a time he was a man who used his powers to their full extent, but now, in the current day and age, he is a more nuanced and ideologically driven figure. His adaptiveness conveys a simple yet profound notion. Good and evil are not absolutes, but change according to time, place, and culture. The point is, Superman, by virtue of what he was created to be, must evolve with the times. Whatever we collectively agree upon as good to be at any given time, Superman has to be that too. And what Superman's history reveals to us is our commitment of his character to be the ideal of moral perfection. Reflecting on the nature of morality and how it can be limited by our current understanding, we realize that what we consider good at any given time is shaped by the context of its time, and that it will most likely change and be viewed as out of date thanks to our hindsight. And this is the challenge that Superman presents to not only his writers, but to us everyday people as well. The same challenge faced by all ethical philosophers since the great Aristotle. The challenge of envisioning what it will be like to fully commit to virtue, only to be undermined by virtue of itself being inconceivable always. As a result, the concept of Superman has now become the representation of the same timeless paradox. A man who stays true to himself by changing who he is. As such, is it really that different imagining what it will be like to be Superman, from Kant's suggestion that we imagine what it will be like if the mere saying of our actions became general laws of nature simply through force of will? Or that reading any philosopher's opinions on the nature of truth, justice, and good, any different from asking ourselves the simple question, what would Superman do? Taking a view through Superman's adventures from his inception in 1938 to modern times, we notice a series of attempts to represent the moral spokesman who always acts based on his commitment to the good, a good that is treated as absolute but can never be more than loosely defined. Initially, he was seen as a hero who focused on politics. A couple decades later, as different writers took on the character, they began exploring the deeper acts of his morality, and over the subsequent decades he was transformed into someone who had a dedication to moral goodness via a form of love, rather than good actions inspired by legal principles. Today, Superman embodies a level of selflessness that edges on the excessive. Modern Superman stands by his principles no matter what, no matter how much it hurts him inside, completely selfless and just. He views himself as the protector of the people that adopted and accepted him. It's not that he won't take a life, it's that he is fundamentally incapable of crossing that line. The role as the guardian of Earth is so deeply integrated into his core that the act of killing is of existential impossibility for him. Yet another era in which he and Batman differ. Nietzsche explored the concept of the Overman using many allegories in his writings, but if we had to boil it down to a single phrase, it would be, pain is unavoidable and must be accepted. He talked a lot about the nature of suffering, suggesting that since it cannot be avoided, it should be embraced. This is a lot easier to put into theory than practice. Nietzsche argues that accepting pain is important in gaining a deeper appreciation for life itself. This is what Overman embodies, pain. And Superman knows a little something about pain as well. He has endured significant pain in his life, but he doesn't buckle under his own suffering, no matter what. Even if he wishes to, he cannot stop overhearing the pain of billions of people around the world. He carries this emotional weight with him at all times. Despite seemingly having the power to save everyone, he cannot. Whenever he saves one person, he sacrifices another, which further adds to his burden. It could very easily overwhelm him, but he finds the strength within him to stay resilient. He accepts this burden and allows it to guide his decisions, assuring that he never forgets the great impact his existence has on people. To murder someone, you must first completely detach yourself from them, dehumanize them in your eyes. Superman, by his very nature and identity, is physically incapable of that. He's an incredibly empathetic person. He perceives the suffering of others on a level we cannot even begin to imagine. This empathy fuels his hope that even the most irredeemable people can be saved, and he cannot rob them of their chance at redemption. Superman's belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity drives him to see beyond our flaws, to inspire us to overcome. He's always looking for a way to help, whether it's in a big, like providing emotional support for a suicidal kid, or in a small way, like making a lighthearted cartoon for children. He actually, genuinely wants to help them be their best selves. As John C. Wright had stated before, Superman has never, in any incarnation, acted mysterious or alien. Good day, sir.